Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to say thank you to our viewers again that are present today. And I would also like to say thank you to our viewers following us on Facebook and our viewers on our YouTube channel. So welcome to today's final 2020 NAP6 Natural Resource Fair webinar series. I would like to take the opportunity to thank all our presenters for providing very useful information from their respective programs and sharing their expertise with our producers and viewers. Thank you again. So before we begin, I would like to take this time to thank our co-sponsors for this event. The Western Extension Risk Management Education Center and DNET Inc. for allowing the NAP6 project to provide this opportunity to our producers to learn more about local USDA programs, Navajo Nation programs, and by providing a great learning platform to better their operation in regards to better agricultural practices. Native American Producers Success Project, or NAPS in short, is a collaborative effort between the DNET Inc., a nonprofit organization, the New Mexico Cooperative Extension Services, and the DNET College Land Grant Office. We currently have two projects operating in both New Mexico and Arizona. The New Mexico NAP6 field staff consists of myself, Jesse Jim, and Jana Johnson. The Arizona NAP7 field staff are Sadie Lister and Sharon Sandman. Okay, so the project is funded by USDA's Office of Partnership and Public Engagement and Outreach Assistance for Socially Disadvantaged and Veteran Farmers Program. The overall goal of the NAPS project is to increase profitability and long-term sustainability of Navajo farmers and ranchers. To help us achieve this goal, there are some activities that we are currently providing in 4 key areas, which are to improve Navajo farm and ranch operations, increasing our Navajo farmers and ranchers' knowledge of and access to available programs and technical assistance provided by USDA, BIA, Navajo Nation, New Mexico Cooperative Extension Services, the DNET Land Grant, the DNET College, Land Grant Office, and other professionals. We are also strengthening the organizational capacity of the Navajo Farmer and Rancher Congress to address the current and future needs of Navajo farmers and ranchers. And lastly, facilitating Navajo farmers and ranchers' use of USDA programs such as NRCS, FSA, and RMA programs. So on a normal year, we host one-day natural resource fairs at different locations to facilitate information sharing between producers and USDA programs, Navajo Nation programs, universities, colleges, nonprofit organizations, and other agricultural service providers and professionals to increase our Navajo farmers and ranchers' knowledge of and access to available programs to improve their farm and ranch operations. But due to the COVID-19 pandemic, as many of you know, public meeting gatherings have been restricted. So what we have done with our producers and to stay compliant is to provide our 2020 Natural Resource Fair in a series of 5 one-hour webinars. So as you can see on our slide, our Natural Resource Fair webinar series began in June with the New Mexico FSA program updates, available NRCS conservation programs in McKinley and San Juan counties, the Navajo Nation Department of Agricultural's Tribal Ranches program, followed by a great presentation last week on understanding soil health from the New Mexico State NRCS resource conservationists. So today we will finish up our Natural Resource Fair webinar series with Delane City at today's Economics of Tribal Range Management presentation. As a side note, like I said in the beginning, these presentations are recorded and available for your viewing on our New Mexico NAP 6 Facebook page and YouTube channel. Let's go ahead and start with today's presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Delane Atsley. I'd like to thank Jesse Jim for inviting me to do this presentation for New Mexico Native American Producers Project. And you know, my background is pretty heavy into business, agribusiness mostly. But you know, here last several years I got more involved with range management. That was my minor in college. So I'll go ahead and present this presentation, Economics of Tribal Rangeland Management. Okay. All right, for some reason it's not. Okay. And here's a little bit of my background. I'm an executive director for Indian Nations Conservation Alliance. We're helping tribes across the United States establish conservation districts, and that focuses on their natural resource use. I also have a company that I started, Arrowhead Resource Management. We mostly deal in range management and ranch management. I started over 27 years ago with the Navajo Livestock Program in Tuba City, working for the veterinarian out there. And we started with herd health. And so it's been a long, exciting career in agriculture and natural resource management. I got my business master's in ranch management and agribusiness from the King Ranch Institute for ranch management, and that was down in Kingsville, Texas, working at the King Ranch. And then I got a bachelor's in agribusiness from Oklahoma Panhandle State. Some of my past employers were the Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Nature Conservancy, and various ranches. Throughout my career, I started working in Tuba City, and then eventually I went to the big, not big, what do they call that? Peaks Ranch, the Navajo Peaks Ranch, and I worked there for a while, and then I started working my way into New Mexico, and then eventually Oklahoma, and then down to South Texas, and then I stopped managing ranches when I moved to Kansas, and then I decided to come back and work for some of these federal agencies, and now I'm the executive director of this alliance. Right now they have me on the board of directors for NAPI out of Farmington, and one of the things I'm really pushing there is to have them do some custom grazing, start their custom grazing program. So this is, I think this is the first year that we actually made some good progress with it, and I'm hoping we can get some more tribal ranchers to get onto this custom grazing program and graze their stockers, and eventually, hopefully, we can get the feedlot going, so you know, the Navajo ranchers can put their cattle in a NAPI feedlot, and I'm hoping that eventually we can take it all the way to finish, and we can have a true Navajo beef product that is you know, controlled by the Navajos from A to Z. They do have me as a candidate for National Grazing Lands Coalition for their board of directors, and then also Holistic Management International. It looks like I'll be on their board later this year. And then the Society for Rangeland Management, they're going to have a vote later this year to see if they'll get me on their board of directors. So that's kind of my background. So a lot of these pictures, are all of these pictures that I have in this this presentation are pictures that I took in the places that I managed. And I'd like to put it out there. If anybody has any questions, make sure you raise a hand or try to speak up so We don't have to wait till the end of this presentation to answer any questions. Okay, so what is range management and what is and conservation? To me, they kind of go hand in hand. Rangeland management is having an adequate supply of forage that is a sustainable supply for whatever endeavors that you're trying to do on that rangeland, whether it's you know, having sheep or goats or cattle, or in this case bison. And also conservation is more of a holistic approach to that, to where there is enough forage and rangeland for not only the commodity products that you're growing for sale, but also for vegetation for wildlife and other, you know, the whole, all the users for that forage. So to me, that's what range management and conservation is. Okay, I'm gonna play a couple short videos that discuss the tragedy of the commons. And this is kind of the situation that we're facing with community grazing areas. You know, I understand that quite a bit of the rangeland on Navajo especially is not fenced off. You know, we do have, we have a kind of a joint grazing area, and a lot of times it's family members or non-family members that share that resource. So this is a little video about the tragedy of the commons, and the commons will be explained later, but that's more of a English term of a joint grazing area. So I'll go ahead and play this for you right now.
This is a model called the tragedy of the commons, which should be called the problem with open access, since it has little to do with the commons, and tragedy is kind of dramatic. Let's say there's some land with grass on it that people use as pasture for their animals. Nobody owns it, and anyone can come and graze their livestock here. We're assuming that people don't communicate or work together, so we would call this an open access field. Let's assume the number of animals this field can feed is based on the quantity and quality of the grass, which is based on the health of the soil, and it can only hold this many animals. This is the carrying capacity. If animals are added beyond this, the grass can't regrow fast enough to support them all. Also, the grass protects the soil from erosion. If too many animals are around, the field may decline in productivity, lowering the carrying capacity. The animals will be less healthy and provide lesser quality products, lowering the profit each animal provides. So it's in this group's best interest to keep the number of animals on the field at or below the carrying capacity. But every herdsman that puts an animal on the field will get the direct benefit that animal provides for them, but they would only share a portion of the cost of the degraded field. If the field were at carrying capacity and a herdsman decides to add an extra animal, the added animal takes some of the food that would have gone to the others. This reduces their value. The owner of that additional animal comes out ahead because even though all his animals are a little bit less healthy, he has more of them. But each herdsman acts under these incentives and will keep adding animals to their herd or let their animals graze longer, so long as it's profitable to themselves. But really, they're all losing out, kind of like the prisoner's dilemma. Contrast this to a situation where only one person owns it. If they add an extra animal, they're only hurting themselves, so they don't do it. Since new people can't be excluded from the field, there's almost no point in boycotting the use because someone else could just come in. None of the herdsmen own the field, and they can see that the field may not be around forever. They see no point in conservation and just try to use it before someone else does. Okay, so we can go on to apply this model to unregulated open access fisheries, open access forests, and unregulated college dorm sink. But the problem with applying this model to the real world is that we have to assume, among other things, that people don't communicate or work together, which isn't true. With a field like this, people will generally get together and make plans about its use. They may act as a single unit or just partition it into sections, and they'll regulate the number of people that can use it. And if people are working together and communicating, then it's not really open access. It's not like every management situation is open access until somebody does something about it. So you don't tend to see the open access problem because people don't work together. You tend to see it in situations where people can't work together. Sometimes people are forced into a situation where they're not allowed to work together. Check out this video. Also, the larger the management area is, the more difficult communication and influencing each other becomes. For example, the global management of greenhouse gas emissions tends to take on some open access properties. Basically, this model is a way of communicating that when people can't work together on a resource, you call it open access, and it's bad, which is why the model should have been called the problem with open access.
so the takeaway from that video, and the reason why I really wanted to put it in here, was just to show that, you know, you have a carrying capacity that is set by nature. You know, that what is on that area is what you have to work with. A lot of times we're trying to put a square piece into a round hole, and it's not going in there, and we're trying to force it in there, and it's not going to happen. And so with this grazing capacity, that's our parameters that we have to work within. And then inside of that, we as cattle producers, our livestock producers, we determine our stocking rate. And what this tragedy of the commons kind of explains is that, you know, when there's no regulation and no communication, the resources get overused, and ultimately that draws down on the value of the livestock. So say for an example, you try to, and realistically your cattle don't stay in a body condition score of 5 throughout the year. You know, 5 or 6, you think that would be optimal on rangeland, but throughout the year it fluctuates, especially after they're you know, the cows are lactating, and maybe into winter they drop a few body scores. And so so if we stay within that parameter and we have adequate stocking rates on our side, you know, that would lead to more sustainable grasslands that we can use. But the other thing we got to think about is our utilization. You know, we can't always max out the carrying capacity, the stocking rate to the carrying capacity. We gotta actually only use a fraction of what's out there. And the reason I'm saying this is because there's also wildlife that we have to think about, and all the, you know, all the natural processes that happen. You know, there's trample of the feed that goes on naturally when the cattle are out there. You'll see an example of it when you see these paths back to the water source. You'll see and that forage is trampled all the way back to the water source. So things like that you got to take into consideration. And I'll go ahead and play you this next video, and it's similar to this one, but it goes into a little more in depth. And let me see if I can get to the next slide.
In the manors of feudal England, there were some constituent lands that were available for shared use. One of the types of these common lands were common pastures. The commoners were not their owners, but by tradition, they had the right to graze livestock upon them. Over time, the extent of common pastures shrank due to the process of enclosures. However, one could see a vast difference between commons and private lands. In 1833, British economist William Forster Lloyd asked, "Why are the cattle on a common so puny and stunted? Why is the common itself so bare-worn? Why is it cropped so differently from the private lands?" Imagine two pastured lands of the same size. One is a common pasture that is used by 10 peasants, and the other is divided into 10 identical lots, each used as a private pasture by one of the 10 different owners. Both pasture lands can feed up to 50 cattle in a year before being unable to regenerate crops. 5 cattle can be grazed upon each of the identical private lots. Private owners would like to graze more cattle per year upon their lots, but they know that if they would, there's a high risk that it would make their lots barren, such that no cow could be grazed upon them in the next year. The benefits of using the pastures for many years were higher than a one-off profit from allowing more cattle to graze upon them. Commoners who used the common pastures were no less competent. They also knew that no more than 50 cattle at a time should graze upon the common pasture. As long as there were fewer than 50 cattle grazing upon the common pasture, everything was fine. The cattle population grew, however, and at first the limit was reached, and then exceeded. One of the commoners, called Gilbert, thought to himself, "So far each of us has been grazing 5 cows upon the pasture, but now I have more cattle. Grazing another cow is a risk because the pasture could turn barren. I should not do it then. Unfortunately, the commoners were influenced by different incentives than those affecting private lot owners. Gilbert was worried. How can I be sure that another commoner will not graze an extra cow? In such a case, I will not be able to use the pasture next year, as it will be barren, and at the same time my 6th cow will be less fed this year. If I do the right thing by not grazing the extra cow, not only will I save the pasture for next year, but at the same time I will save it for someone else this year. That is why I decided to bring an extra cow to the pasture. Gilbert's action marked a simple regularity. The cow is his private property, so the more of his cattle that graze on the pasture, the better it is for him. The pasture, however, is common property. This is why all potential losses will be shared by everyone. And since Gilbert's private profit will probably outweigh his share in the shared loss, it definitely pays for him to graze the next cow. And he should do it quickly, before someone else comes up with the idea. In fact, others did come up with the same idea, and did graze more cattle than the land could sustain. As a result, nature's supply for the ever-increasing consumption became unsustainable. The pasture turned barren and was taken over by weeds, inedible for animals. The cows became puny and stunted, ceased to give milk, and finally died. By acting in their own self-interest, the commoners worked not only to the detriment of others, but also to their own detriment in the long term. To put it simply, they were cutting the branch they were sitting on. In 1968, Professor of Human Ecology Garrett Hardin put the subject back into spotlight with his article, The Tragedy of the Commons. By recalling Lloyd's work, Hardin delineated the issue of the tragedy of the commons, which consists in the fact that when people have free access to a shared resource, by acting rationally in their own self-interest, they cause the rest of society and themselves to suffer losses in the long run. This is because the institution of common property motivates people to abuse resources and at the same time to neglect their maintenance and renewal. He notes, "Ruin is the destination toward which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons. Freedom in a commons brings ruin to all." Let us try to pinpoint the root cause of the problem. Up to a certain point, the common resources are so abundant that anyone can use them freely without any adverse effects. For example, a pasture that can feed 50 cattle will not be made barren by 3 cattle, even if feeding is all they do. A single angler cannot hope to catch all the fish in a large lake, just as a small group of inhabitants of the Great Plains will not contribute to the decline of the American bison population. There is a turning point, however, at which nature cannot possibly restore such resources. A pasture, for instance, can only feed a certain number of animals during a given time. A lake can only sustain a certain number of fishermen and anglers each year before its fish population starts to diminish. And there is no such thing as an infinite bison supply on the Great Plains. At some point, the increase in the number of animals, fishermen, anglers, and hunters causes the land to suffer from overcrowding. Freedom of access to the common resources promotes a tendency for their excessive use and for the neglect of their maintenance and renewal. One contemporary example of the tragedy of the commons is high seas. According to the law, everyone has equal access to these waters. For example, everyone has the right to fish in the high seas. Given constant rise of population, modernization of fishing techniques, and other factors, nature just cannot sustain its output. The eponymous tragedy consists in the fact that the law encourages fishermen to catch as much fish as possible. In doing so, the law drives fishermen to catch unsustainable amounts of fish, and thus to damage aquatic resources, instead of encouraging them to care about keeping the fish population at suitable levels. Are there any ways to avoid the tragedy of the commons? Yes, but there is no single universal cure that will work in all conditions. We can instead denote 3 general groups of solutions. Hardin suggested 2 of them. 1. Creating and selling property rights to scarce resources, which allows for a change in incentives and for exclusion of others from the use of said resources. And 2. Top-down regulations of the right to enter areas endowed with such resources. Later research by Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom, among others, has shown, however, that there is one more group of solutions, namely 3. Bottom-up institutions. There are some examples that show under the right conditions, some communities were able to establish rules that allowed for a long-term and sustainable use of shared resources. Contrary to what has been implied by Hardin's work, people using a common resource are not necessarily condemned to repeat the tragedy of the commons. They can talk things through and create adequate institutions. Effective management of shared resources gets easier as more of the following conditions are met. It is easy to monitor resources and their use, and for the information thus gathered can be verified and understood at relatively low cost. Rates of change in resources, resource use population, technology, and economic and social conditions are moderate. Communities maintain frequent personal communication and dense social networks that promote mutual trust and encourage greater respect for established rules. The community can exclude outsiders at a relatively low cost from using the common resource, and resource users support effective monitoring and rule enforcement. We will endeavor to describe specific examples of such solutions and their effects in one of our next videos. You are more than welcome to visit econclips.com, where you will find more of our work.
The take-home message out of that video is to, stay within your carrying capacities again, but also understand that the shared resources, it has to be managed. As you saw, the 3 suggestions for fixing this tragedy of the commons is the one at the very end was cooperating with each other and communication. And that's where presentations like this and Jesse's organization and the organization that I manage, Indian Nations Conservation Alliance, that's where we're trying to do our best to help educate ranchers and farmers and to best utilize these resources so we can make up our own terms and regulations and make it better on our terms, rather than have somebody come in like they did in the 1930s with Mr. Collier and do massive herd reductions. And then the first option was private sale of lands, which most likely won't happen on federal trust lands that we're sharing. So, okay, this is a picture of we had about 600 head of heifers. And the reason why I like this slide is because, if this was just cattle, and you can imagine them different sizes, different weights, different breeds, some with horns, some without horns. But you look at this herd, and we got this herd pretty much uniform to where, their backbones are pretty much the same height. We got red Angus and black Angus heifers in here. And so we stepped up the value of these cattle from just a commodity value that you take to the local auction. These cattle, we stepped up the value of them to where we can deal in private treaties or some kind of transaction that we don't have to take them to the auction and get the commodity market price at that day. We can try to shoot for new goals for better prices for our animals, our livestock, because ultimately what we're doing is the grass in the background, we're converting that grass to money. And it really depends on your management skills and how intensive you want to manage it. You are capable of getting more for your cattle, but it depends on your management skills. If an example of a low management skill would be maybe about 20 of these or 50 are head of these cattle, but if you imagine them all different breeds, some all have horns, they have brands all over their bodies, they're not on a vaccination program, they don't have adequate forage, they're a lot skinnier than this. we're basically, for example, we're getting from the auction like $1.40 a pound. And in the reverse of this is with more management, and we got an economy of scale right here. We got more cattle, and that gives us a little more flexibility to explore some more marketing options. So these cattle, we would demand a higher price for them just for our management skills. And in this situation at this ranch, this belonged to the Nature Conservancy, and I managed the livestock. And we would have them in designated areas throughout the ranch and rotate them. We used an awful lot of electric fencing and solar fencing. Solar electric fencing is what we use. And they got to the point where they didn't try it. But another example, at this ranch, we also had bison, and then we also had cow-calf pairs. So when I was talking to a group about 2 weeks ago, and there were some cattle people from Western Agency, I explained to them that with your management skills and whatever your carrying capacity and whatever your natural growth is, and we're converting that grass. So if we're going to convert that grass to money, if we have wild horses out there, in fact, in a way, that's our commodity that's going to be exchanged for money. So a wild horse, when you capture them and they sell them, they're around 15 cents a pound. And when you have cattle that are sub prime, I guess, you're down to 1.30 a pound. Or you have better quality cattle, you could get $1.60, $1.80 a pound, depending on their weight. And with the bison, the income off the bison, the going rate at that time was $5.15 a pound. And that was, to me, that was pretty neat to manage all those different groups at once, because and we'll go into this later more, the cow cost was a lot less for the bison. I think the bison, we were down to like $213 to manage the bison per year, whereas the cattle was a lot more. And on Navajo, I remember University of Arizona did a study back in I think it was in the late 90s, and at that time the cow cost in that area was around $1,200 per cow, and that was 20 years ago. So I imagine that really increased since then, maybe $1,500 or $1,800 now. In some places it might be over $2,000. And so that's what you got to take into account when you sell your calf, for $800. In some instances you might be upside down $800 because of your cow costs, or you might be upside down $1,000 because of your cow costs. So that's just something to think about. Is there any questions or any comments?
No, I don't see any.
Okay. Jesse, do you have any?
No, not right now.
Okay. All right. I'm probably doing a good job of confusing everyone then. But I was talking about putting a square peg into a round hole. Sometimes we're trying to do that. We're trying to graze animals where there probably shouldn't be grazing, and when you increase your management skills and you get more resources, and you do more research, you're fine-tuning your management skills. So say you bought a ranch and you wanted to figure out how to fence it off so you could have better gains on your cattle. You know, one of the main things to look at is your soils. You know, what kind of soils you have, what grasses are conducive to growing on those soils. You know, what kind of native grasses are there, because native grasses are probably they're natural out there. And then when you start introducing grasses, you know, that's when you start seeding or plugging some of these grasses, and your costs will go up. So if you can manage your native grasses, I think, you know, you should be better off if we could manage native grasses versus seeding areas. Because in a way you want to go back, and this is what I was talking about earlier, is a good comparison for me on that ranch was always the bison. What can the bison get away with? And you know what, and I always thought maybe we should start running our cattle as much like bison as possible. You know, try to calve when they're calving, try to use that new growth that they're hitting when they're calving. And also, you know, it's increasing their milk production. And it just lowers your input when you go along with nature instead of fighting nature. And as you fine tune your management, you know, you'll figure out your forage production. And I'll show you a couple clips here pretty soon regarding forage production. And that's just the pounds per acre that your land produces. If you can learn how to either eyeball that ocular, or you can do more scientific stuff like clipping and weighing, and then plug it into, you know, these different formulas. And then also, you know, evaluate your nutritional value of forages. And when I say forages, I'm referring strictly to natural grasses out there. In my experience with the ranches that I was on and managed, there was no such thing as feeding hay to the cows, because that started dipping into our profit margins. We wouldn't think about feeding hay to the cows, especially in the places that I was at. We don't get heavy enough rains that warrants us feeding a huge amount of hay. You know, we wanted some of these the livestock, the cattle, or even the bison to forage for themselves and find that grass. And we'll get into some grass banking talk pretty soon. But if you understand the nutritional value of forages and what grasses are more nutritional for the livestock, you know, that increases your management skills. And then the seasons of best use. A lot of times on a ranch, you have different elevations, you got different topography, you got different soils, ecosystems. You know, some places you can get in and out of during certain times, and if it's muddy, you can't get in certain areas. So that just goes with, you know, increasing your management skills. And then kind of have an idea of your precipitation. And you know, like here in Taos, we're fortunate in the afternoons, like right now in July, that we can pretty much rely on afternoon, early evening showers. But you know, in April and May and June was pretty dry, and that we're in a D2 extreme drought condition here. And it's like that toward the Four Corners D2 drought condition. And then quite a bit of the Navajo Nation is under D1 drought conditions now. And my thinking is if you know, if we're at that point right now, we got to really think about our options of destocking or having some kind of exit strategy in case we got to do that. Or maybe another option is trying to get a pivot contracted at NAPI. You know, that's a viable option available to native producers. Okay, and then our carrying capacity and stocking rates, we already discussed that earlier. I think we understand that part. And then when I was working for the BLM, I was in grazing management and grazing. We had to actually you know, kind of police the people that we had on federal lands. And so in April, we would go out there and look for key plant species that were growing at that time. And we would literally go out there and measure them. And if they weren't up to a certain height that was predetermined as healthy, we wouldn't let the grazers or the people that lease federal lands come on that land until they did reach those heights, and you know, the health of those grasses wouldn't be compromised. So it's a good idea to, you know, understand your key plant species and kind of use them as a gauge. And like always, you got to inventory what you have. What do you have available for rangeland? You know, if and it really kind of ties into your ultimate goals for your ranch and your herd. We don't, you know, some places say we have 500 acres, and that might, in here in the Southwest, 500 acres sounds like a good chunk of land, and it is, but when we come to stocking it with cattle, we might only be able to have 10 head of cattle on 500 acres, you know, grazing. And so if we're going to want to have more than 10 head, you know, we got to look into other options. And other options might be leasing state land or leasing federal grazing lands, like Forest Service or BLM lands. And for me, I try to lease private ownership lands, and I try to form that relationship with them, and so it's beneficial to both of us. So I can keep up the fencing, you know, and I can monitor their range land. In exchange, you know, I give them whatever grazing fees that we agreed on, and then we get to graze the animals. In our situation out here, we're starting to get more cheatgrass. So I explained to them that, you know, if we don't knock that cheatgrass out in the spring, that it's going to take off and it might cause more of a fire hazard in the summer. And so they kind of like that idea of you know, the cattle kind of benefiting them by knocking down some of the fuels if there ever is a fire. Okay, and then another inventory is your infrastructure. You know, how far are the cattle going to travel from water? And most people say, you know, in the books they say 1.5 miles, but you know, on the res you see them travel a lot further than that. You know, 2 or 3 times that amount. So and if your infrastructure, you know, if you do have them that far away from infrastructure, or you're hauling water out there every 2 days or something, you know, that is gonna change the body condition score of your animals, especially if they're walking, you know, 5 miles to go get something to eat and then 5 miles to get a drink. They're basically walking off the gain that they got put on them. Or if they got to come back and meet you every 2 days when you fill up a water trough, that's going to take some gain off of them. So you got to really analyze your management to see, you know, what best fits your area. And you know, I really tell people that the business model that we need to follow is one that we built locally. We shouldn't follow business models that were in Kansas, business models that are in South Texas, our business models along the grain belt, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and in that area. Sometimes, those are the only publications that we get. And a lot of that RFD TV, they're kind of centralized in that area. And so when they show you all these huge cattle and lush areas, that's their business model. That's what works for them. We got to tweak it to where it works for us. And thinking about that, we might want to consider calving early. I mean, not calving early, weaning early. A lot of the industry is saying that, don't bring a cow in until it's 600, or, I'm not going to buy it unless it's 650 pounds. Well, just looking at our available our forage out there, the cows they eat a set amount, say one AUM, that they're good for 1 month. Well, if we have some horses out there, and they're eating 1.5 AUMs, and say we have 5 goats that are sheep that equal 1 AUM, all of that is putting more strain on our forage. And so when that cow has a calf, a lot of times we don't account for that. We think that, it's drinking milk, but that only happens for the first few months. And then it turns to forage to where it starts consuming numbers around 5 pounds a day, whereas the mama cows are eating 25 pounds a day. So total, they're putting a strain of 30 pounds a day, just that pair right there. So that's something to take into account. Okay, wildlife is another inventory you want to keep in mind. That depending on your management and your skills, there's some ranches that do make they make money, an awful lot of money off of wildlife. I know that there's some ranches that sell wildlife hunts that for $5,000, and some of them sell for a lot more, and that gives back to the overhead of managing your ranch. And I think wildlife is a good gauge to tell you if you're managing something properly. I talked to my grandma an awful lot. She's 101 years old, and she's from the Comine Mesa area of Arizona. And she, I asked her, what were things like when you were a little girl? And she talks about tall grasses and antelope, and you don't see antelope in that area. And but she, I think if we do ever get back to that point, we'll know that we're managing at an optimum level. Okay, other places that you want to inventory is your watershed, your water quality, and also erosion issues in your area. And then, inventory your cattle. And the reason why I put the cattle on there is what kind of breeds are we working with? Are we working, and we'll show a video regarding this, and I'll go ahead and get moving a little forward, a little quicker. But I'll let that cattle part be explained further in that next video. Okay, this is just a picture of one of the windmills we managed, and here at the Nature Conservancy, we had to do our own windmill maintenance. We wouldn't consider waiting for somebody to come fix it for us. We would try to fix it ourselves, and then sometimes we would contract work to get it done ourselves. And then we just spread that cost over our cow costs or over our custom grazing charges to recoup what we invested into the infrastructure. Okay, there's different things you can do with range improvement. You can do a mechanical brush control, to open up some of that area so it is grazable. So you beat back maybe some of the sagebrush and open it up so some more grass could be exposed, that some more sunlight gets down to those to the grass, and it can and start to take off. Another option, and not so much in the real desert Southwest, but in Kansas, we used to use a lot of prescribed burning, and we would use that to manage our fields and make the grass more productive. And then we also had a biological weed control, and right now we're doing some of that with our conservation, and it's called biocontrol. And then there's also reseeding, and then chemical treatments. And the chemical treatment, a lot of our rangeland out there, especially at the tribal level, we're not using it to we're not treating it with chemicals because there's just a vast amount of rangeland. And I talked to a guy a couple months ago, maybe more than that, maybe about 4 months ago, and we were talking about the potential of native beef and getting a premium for native ranchers. And he was telling me that if we can have cattle that are documented on areas of the reservation that have never ever been treated by chemicals, we can get over a 10-cent premium just for getting that documented, saying that they're not eating anything chemically treated. Okay, I'm gonna try to move along a little faster now. These are just some ways of monitoring photo points, plots, utilization, monitoring, transits, visual, and range readiness is what I was talking about earlier, monitoring the key species. And a lot of times you could achieve all of these at a smaller level just by using your phone to take pictures of your rangeland, and you just try to get a big maybe a certain rock or a tree in the background, and you stake that area off with a T-post or something if the cows don't bend it, but you can always go back there and take pictures throughout the year for that area. I was contracted to do some range assessments for the Hopi Nation on behalf of NRCS back in 2011, and this is the rangeland that was right around 200 pounds per acre. So this is an example of what 200 pounds per acre looks like. And what you do with this is, say your total ranch, the total acreage of your ranch, you multiply that, basically if everything's pretty similar by that 200 pounds per acre, and that gives you your total forage. And then you divide it by, the amount of usage that you're anticipating in that area. How much of this, say I got 50 cows and they eat, 25 pounds a day, how much of that is going to be utilized by the cattle, and then you can break it down to your utilization. Okay, this is a stocker ranch that I managed in Kansas, and I'm moving them to new pasture right here. This is probably around I'd say, I think it was right around 2,800 pounds per acre or 2,500 pounds per acre. And this picture, why I like this picture so much is it was just me that was out there moving these cattle. And way in the distance, you can see our headquarters off in the background. And how I accomplished this is there's a roadway, and I use the right-of-way to keep the cows in the right-of-way. So I started off, as you know, there's always an alpha cow or alpha animals. I got them hooked on some pellets that I had, and I just kind of drew them out slowly. And next thing you know, the cows way in the back don't really know why they're walking, but they're not going to be left behind. So they just had that mentality that they use to keep in a bunch. So all this kind of ties into each other: low stress handling, knowing your forage, your marketing, your even your conservation efforts, and we'll go into that pretty soon. Okay, your grazing management. And I was told in grad school that as long as you're doing something, that's better than nothing. You know, if you have them on there continuously right now, if you put at least one fence up, you know, you're making a difference. And the more fences you start to put up, or the more hot wires you start to put up, or maybe you're out there herding them like sheep, the more you can move them around, the better. And so that's where these, you know, these grazing management get more intensive, like deferred rotation. You know, we started using that in Kansas so we can build up a grass bank. And when I said that, we didn't feed hay at all. What we did is we would defer different pastures throughout the year, and we wouldn't touch them until wintertime. And then we would turn the cattle out there, and they had grass. It wasn't high in energy or protein, but it was still, you know, grass that would sustain them through the winter. And so they would go and utilize our grass banking. And then there's also rest rotation, best pasture management, and intensive grazing. Right now, intensive grazing is what a lot of these guys are really pushing. You know, having more cattle per acreage kind of deal. Okay, here's a video if we can talk about cost of cattle production.
Well, a good rule of thumb has always been that it costs about $1 a day to run a cow in Oklahoma. Well, as Dave Lawman is here to tell us, those costs have gone up. Dave, what's the deal?
Well, they have. You know, expenses all the way around have gone up, and certainly in the cow-calf enterprise. And so, yeah, what we thought we'd do is just share some kind of recent calculations. We've gone over some of our enterprise budgets, and it looks like those costs have gone up substantially.
Let's start with the enterprise budget. What is this? And what are we gonna see here? What are you calculating?
Well, we're just basically calculating estimated costs to run a cow, and then estimated income, you know, based on number of steers and heifers that a cow-calf enterprise would sell, number of cull cows, and the estimated price for those cull cows, maybe some replacement heifers that didn't breed, and so on. The enterprise budget also includes operating costs, you know, feed and veterinary and all those expenses you would expect, interest, and so on. So a very thorough tool available. You can get the enterprise budgets from the AgEcon website.
Right. Or you can also find it on our website at sunup.okstate.edu. All right, well, let's start at the beginning. And what are we seeing here?
Well, you know, as you mentioned, for a long time, we told folks that the enterprise budget showed that the average cost of keeping a cow in Oklahoma was about $1 a day. And today, we estimate that it's about $1.35. So it's gone up substantially. The budget that we use, that I'll tell you a little bit about, assumes that a rancher would rent most of the pasture that he uses for his cows. So not a lot of fixed costs from purchased or owned land. Right. We used a typical stocking rate in north central Oklahoma. Rental rate, according to the AgEcon survey, is about $13 per acre. We're using an average stocking rate of about 10 acres per cow. Okay. That budget shows an overall cost of $492.
Oh, wow. So it's gone up
substantially. Of that budget, $379 is operating costs, and $113 is fixed costs. And of course, if we had a substantial amount of owned land, the proportion of fixed costs would be higher.
Right.
Another interesting part of that budget is that about 53% of the budget is due to feed costs, which includes pasture, supplemental hay, supplemental protein, and mineral. So a total there of about $260 in feed.
Just in feed, wow. Has that gone up at all, or has that stayed pretty level?
No, it's gone up drastically. I'd say, you know, when I arrived here in Oklahoma at OSU, we used to think that feed and pasture $120 to $140 or $50, but now it's $260. So
Wow.
Pressure on pasture land, has increased dramatically, and so yeah, that's substantially higher than it used to be.
Any tips for producers or things that they can think about if they're going to maybe try to tackle some of those extra costs?
You bet. And trying to minimize, particularly that pasture, supplemental feed, mineral cost, all those things. That's an area that I work on every day. That's kind of my specialty, and we talk about it on Sunup occasionally. But overall, yeah, there's two long-term things that we might mention. And then there's two things that I'll mention in general that you could work on and have a more sudden impact on, or more immediate impact on. One is matching cows to the environment from a genetic standpoint.
Right.
Try to find and develop, maintain low maintenance cows.
Right.
Secondly, matching the calving seasons to the regional conditions and ranch resources. Okay, and Dr. Selk talks a lot about optimal calving season based on the resources you have, and that's a real key and just an awesome opportunity for people to minimize those costs.
Right.
Okay, two things that you could have more immediate impact on, I think we probably don't talk enough about, and that's just grazing management.
Right.
Really good grazing management with a focus on proper stocking rate just has an incredible impact. If you overgraze, you wind up with thin cows that don't breed back very well, and you have to purchase a lot of supplemental feed, and that's expensive input. The fourth thing is just strategic supplementation. Right. Doing your homework every year, not just use tradition, to try to do what you can to minimize the amount of purchased and harvested forages and supplemental feed.
All right, and those four topics, I think we could go a lot more in depth with those beyond just what we're doing now. And maybe that's something we'll do over the next few weeks here on Sunup. We'll dig a little bit more into each of those topics, so be sure you tune in to learn a little bit more from Mr. Lawman. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Some take-home message in this is he was talking about the cow costs in Oklahoma, and over there, many of you probably been there yourselves and seen the huge amount of forage. Once you get into that grain belt area and you get more rainfall, in places like that, they're over 20 inches, 25 inches of rainfall a year. And even with adequate rainfall, their stocking is 1 cow per 10 acres. And that is, I think that's pretty conservative for that area. So I think we just really got to keep in mind our costs. So he mentioned $1 a day historically to $1.35, and this video is about 10 years old. So we got to be pushing at least maybe 250 or something around there. But that's just something to keep in mind is your cow costs, because once you figure out your cow costs, how much it's costing you to raise your cattle, the mama cows particular, and bull costs and everything associated with that, you'll understand what your break even is for your calf. You'll understand how much you need to get per calf, and you get into some more profitability if you do understand your break even. Matching your cows to your environment, that's very important, is to have in the Southwest, is to have a real rangy kind of cow that has that's not going to be affected by flies and insects too much, and pretty hardy cow that has good sound feet that can travel quite a ways. Okay, and then matching your calving to nature, we talked about that earlier, and then also doing a strategic supplementation. So when he was talking about feed costs there, he was talking about, he wasn't so much talking about hay costs, but he was talking about leased land costs, how much it costs to lease land to grow the cattle. So that, in that sense, there's no mechanical need for cutting the cattle. Cutting the grass and feeding it in bales. You're letting the cattle cut their own grass through grazing management in those lease lands. And then he said to be smart about the strategic management part of it. The strategic supplementation part of it. What you're going to use throughout the year. And then this one's a good one. The first few minutes, kind of long, but here we go.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sunup. I'm Lyndall Stout. We begin today out at the North Range, where OSU researchers are looking at cow efficiency. There's some interesting research underway on cattle at OSU. Joining us now is our Extension Beef Cattle Specialist, Dave Lohman. And Dave, let's kind of have an overview of what you guys have been looking at recently.
One of the major research emphasis we've had here at the North Range unit is cow efficiency. And, you know, normally you define efficiency as some measure of input divided by some measure of output. And if you're a commercial cow-calf producer that weans his calves, say in the fall of the year for a spring calving herd, and markets them at that time, your production measure of output is calf weaning weight. Most people can collect that information, you know, whether it's the group weight across the scales at the market or individual weights on the ranch. The difficulty is getting the input side of the efficiency equation with forage intake. If we use just annual forage intake as the measure of input, that's a challenge. So that's kind of what we've been working on.
And then how did you set that up to sort of control those forage intake conditions? It takes a little planning.
It's difficult, and that's why there's no information on cows available really in cow efficiency. You know, there are some other universities and Oklahoma State working on that question now, but it's surprisingly, it just hasn't been researched to a great extent because of the difficulty of measuring forage intake. What we have done here is just we have chosen to measure it directly. So the graduate students come out and they weigh the amount of hay fed to a cow in the morning with an electronic scale. Daylight the next day, then they come back to that feeder with cows in an individual pen, and then they clean the hay up, put it in a big tub or trash can, and weigh it back on the same electronic scale. And the difference between what they fed and what's left over, of course, is intake for that day. And so we measure intake for about a week period of time, and so we get the average intake over that week's period. And then we do that, the weekly measure, or the week-long measure of intake, a number of times throughout the year to reflect, you know, their changing production situation, whether they're gestating or early lactation or late lactation. And then we can estimate annual forage intake.
Okay. You have a couple of cow-calf pairs that you pulled aside to kind of show us sort of the results and your findings. Let's talk about this first pair and this cow that we see here and sort of what you found with her.
Absolutely. Linda, we picked out two cow-calf pairs for our demonstration here today just to show the variation in forage intake and the measure we're calling cow efficiency. And this is the first cow of the pair. This is number 709. She has never missed a calf up to this point in her productive career, so she's a very fertile cow. On average, so far, her calves have weighed 573 pounds at weaning. So she's a very productive cow, does a great job. She weighs 1,424 pounds, okay? So she's a pretty good sized cow. On average, her forage consumption has been at the higher end of the group of cows that we've been measuring, okay? And so on an annual basis, her forage consumption in 2011, we estimated at 10,978 pounds. Okay, now if you divide that by 365, that's about 30.1 pounds of forage per day.
Okay, let's go take a look at the other cow-calf pair that you have for us. Dave, let's talk about some of the obvious physical differences that we see with this cow.
This is a little smaller cow. First of all, her number is 424, and she's also been a very productive cow, just like 709. She's never missed a calf, and she always weans a good-sized calf. Now, physically, yes, she is 120 pounds lighter than the 709 cow. But on average, she has weaned a calf that's weighed 558 pounds through her lifetime. And her annual forage intake is 8,789 pounds, or that's what we have estimated last year. So if you divide that by 365, you should come up with about 24 1/10 pound of forage intake on a daily basis.
Okay. So when you compare the two cows, what does this mean?
Well, if we go back to our efficiency equation, the output, we're going to use the calf weaning weight as the output. And one was 573, the other was 558. So they're both very productive cows. In fact, the 709 cow has a weaning weight ratio of 112, and 424 has a weaning ratio of 111, which just means they wean calves 12 or 11% above the herd average. So they're very productive cows. But then if we look at the input side of the equation, there's obviously some big differences. And the smaller cow, 424, consumes over a ton of forage less in a year. And she does that and still produces a calf that's very comparable to 709. So those are extreme differences. It's one cow's at the lower end of efficiency and the other is at the higher end. But if you think about the value of that over 2,000 pounds difference in forage intake, last year during the drought, it might have cost $125 to almost $200 to purchase that extra ton of forage. And then you've got 15 pounds of additional calf weaning weight to pay for it. And that's probably only worth somewhere between $12 and $20. So it's a big difference.
It is a big difference. Does genetics play in at all on how much they consume?
Well, it certainly could. Absolutely. You'd expect, the bigger cows would consume more forage, and the 709 cow is a bigger cow. You might expect that there would be some within, say, sire line differences and certainly some breed differences. We'll account for those differences at the end of the experiment when we have all the data gathered and try to take some of those factors out of the equation. But what we're trying to get to is, how much variation is there in true efficiency? And can we find a way to identify those animals that are more efficient, consume less forage, but wean big calves still? And then once we identify a way to do that, can we then select for that trait and make tremendous progress?
And some long-term implications.
Absolutely.
Sounds like.
Absolutely. I don't think we've made much progress in cow efficiency if you sell your calves at weaning. This is a way where we could, get to that end of trying to reduce intake, you could reduce stock area, run more animals on the same amount of property and so on if they're more efficient.
Okay. Well, keep us posted on what your findings are, and we'll check back with you when you have more to tell us.
Will do. Thank you for coming.
All right. I'll go ahead and move along a little bit faster. The take home out of this video was just the different sizes of those cows and the different nutritional needs of both of them. And they're calving within, I think, 12 pounds of each other. And there's substantial difference between the amount of intake. One's 10,000 plus pounds of forage per year, and the other one's around 8,000 plus. And that comes down to if you were to buy those square big bales from Nappy, that bigger cow would be eating 11 of them, and the smaller cow would be eating 9 of those bales. And then you would be within 12 pounds of each other calving. And those 12 pounds, that's, like he said, it's less than a $20 difference. So, $20 difference, versus, those extra 3 bales of hay. There's pretty much no comparison. So that's one of the take homes from that. And then, matching the breed or the cow to the resource. Okay, and then here's some other can just touch on what drought, rainfall triggers. You got to have an exit strategy and have it predetermined for our winter, our cool season grasses, in June, what kind of rainfall do we, maybe we want to at least have, 6 or 8 inches by June. And if we don't hit that, we got to consider destocking. Our warm season grasses later in the year, if we don't get enough rainfall, there's gonna be no regrowth. And if there is, it's gonna be very, very little and very, very slow, to where we're gonna go back and the animals, the livestock are gonna hit those grasses again and knock them down even to where there's no blades of grass. And another thing to think about is insurance, drought insurance. I know on Navajo, I think Department of Ag does all the drought insurance. Okay, and that goes into destocking plans. What are your plans? What are going to be the first to go? Maybe steers, maybe cows that aren't getting bred, because you're going to be paying, say, $1,500 for that cow just to stick around a whole year without a calf inside of it. So that might be a reason to get rid of her, because other than that, you're just going to be keeping her around. Or but keeping in mind your destocking plans, there's conservation programs that you can take advantage of with USDA, NRCS. And they have different programs that you can be a part of, and you can get incentives and some payment back for being a part of those programs. Cattle markets are always an influence on rangelands, because when the cattle prices are going up, a lot of people will start to sell their cows, and then vice versa. When the market's down, they tend to retain them. Grass banking, we talked about that earlier, versus buying bales of hay. And then another thing is that's becoming more of an issue now is fragmentation of rangeland, and it also affects wildlife habitat. When somebody wants to go put their trailer in the middle of nowhere, what was traditional grazing land, and then there's water lines and electrical lines run out to it, and then some fencing that separates some of the grazing. That's something to keep in mind. As always, right-of-way use is always an issue. Aging infrastructure, we're dealing with that constantly. A lot of our infrastructure dates back to the 40s and 60s. Dated tribal grazing policies, that's an issue on rangeland. And I always say that our politicians can kill grass or overgraze it from sitting behind a desk as easy as a cow does. And the reason I say that is because if there's no enforcement, or there's favoritism or nepotism, that's a form of eventually it'll lead to overgrazing too. And then riparian areas, those are issues that just to be good stewards of the land, we got to keep that area pretty much pristine, and not really get it trampled, so it adds to water quality for other resource users, not just the cattle. And then water pressure depletion. There's a rancher out in Tucumcari, New Mexico. He had piñon junipers all over his property, and he started to manage them and knock them down and cut them up and use them for firewood. And he realized later that each one of those piñon junipers, there's some research that say they drink up to 20 gallons of water a day. And I forgot the exact amount, but I think it was like 8 gallons per minute was increased to his water supply. An increase of 8 gallons per minute just by knocking some of those trees down and managing some of that piñon juniper. Okay, some of the other issues is illegal dumping, succession plans, permit transfer. That's kind of a big holdup, and in areas, a lot of the reservation, there is high unemployment. There's low there's low, the annual income is pretty low. So, people can actually rely on these cattle, if they manage them properly to start to turn a profit. Invasive, noxious weeds, brush control, we talked about that, overgrazing, wild and feral horses. Some other issues in the future will be the NEPA requirements to do any kind of infrastructure. We're talking about the CARES Act and the $714 million that needs to be spent. And I forgot the exact amount that's going into agriculture, but in order to get that process going, they had, being on federal land, they had to go through the NEPA process. And that's going to, it's going to take a while to get that done. Wildfires are always an issue on rangeland trespassing, illegal grazing in certain areas, managing threatened and endangered species, and also your cultural resources are influence on your rangelands. This is a picture of a young antelope that I was riding, and I turned back and seen it, and he was in the grass, super still. And so I just put that in there just to kind of remind me of, we got to share these resources with the natural inhabitants of the resources, which are the wildlife, and that too has to be managed. This is our last, this is one of the last videos. It's only a couple minutes long, but the reason I'm showing this video is one thing that we might want to shoot for in the future. Instead of increasing our numbers, we can focus on quality versus quantity. And if we focus on quality of these animals, we could actually make up the difference, some more income on the other side, on the bottom end, by participating in these conservation programs like that NRCS one, doing rotations. I forgot the other parts that doing BCS scoring, stuff like that, that will give us money in our pocket for participating in that conservation program. And doing things like this Audubon Society, what they're doing in partnering with Blue Nest Beef to market a wholesome product that's more appealing to the buyer, because they know that there's stewardship back on the ranches that this beef came from, and in turn they're willing to pay a premium for their burgers or roast or steaks, and then that in turn leads to more money for the rancher just by participating in this program. So I'll go ahead and get this started.
Hello, everyone. As many of you know, in the summer of 2019, I kayaked the entire length of the Mississippi River. It took me 62 days and covered over 2,300 miles. I started up in northern Minnesota at Lake Itasca and ended in the Gulf of Mexico, south of Louisiana. It was an amazing adventure and will undoubtedly go down as one of my greatest accomplishments. While on the river, I had endless time to consider the world around me. Without outside interference, I became in tune to the environment I was in. I discovered a strong new desire to become more involved in the preservation of our natural resources and to be more involved in the protection of animals and habitat. And for that reason, I am excited to bring a brand new program to your attention that I am happy to be a part of, as it is a whole new way of looking at conservation and offers us all a chance to be part of the game. The National Audubon Society, a massive group dedicated to the conservation of birds and the preservation and reclamation of bird habitat within the United States, has determined that there was a growing problem with the overgrazing of prairies. Cattle on a piece of land for too long will overstress the environment by eating the native grasses and plants nearly down to the ground. This is hard on the vegetation and wipes out the tall grasses, which countless birds will use to nest and hide from predators in. Birds are a great indicator of an environment, as if the area does not suit their needs, they have the ability to simply fly away. Audubon began a program to certify ranchers to rotationally graze their animals. This prevents cattle from overworking an area. They are moved off the ground before the grasses are eaten down too far. The habitat is spared from having to completely regenerate, and the wildlife continues to utilize the safety and cover provided by a responsibly grazed area. I have begun working with a brand new company called Blue Nest Beef. Launched in November of 2019, Blue Nest works directly with ranchers that have been certified by Audubon to practice rotational grazing. Our company buys direct from ranchers and sells direct to customers. We ship product direct to you. We honor the commitment of our ranchers to maintain this certification, as well as practicing a high standard for ethical treatment of the animals by paying a generous rate for their hard work. The animals will never see a feedlot and are kept as calm and happy as possible their entire lives. It is possible to continue to enjoy the things we love in life, all while being good stewards of the land and being respectful to the animals we rely on. This is conservation in motion. It is something we can all be a part of. This is good for the environment, good for the animals, and thus good for all of us. The offer was made to pay me to make this video. I turned down that offer because I believe in this program. I want to be a part of a responsible-minded way of life because I believe we can continue to enjoy the things we love while having a positive effect on our environment. I'm very excited to share a promotional code with you. Escape with Jay 2020 will get you 20% off your first order through the entire year of 2020. Whether ordering just ground beef or a mixed box of ground and steak, you can try a product that has an excellent flavor profile of a grass-fed animal and the grazing benefit of supporting a responsible care for our prairies, the native wildlife, and the environment, and ethical care and treatment of the animals. All products are grown, processed, and shipped from within the USA. Over 2 million acres have been certified by this fantastic program, and I hope you will help us get that next 1 million. From Montana down to Texas, we are certifying these ranchers to rotationally graze and responsibly keep and care for their animals. BlueNestBeef.com is where you can find more information on our program. I hope at very least you will consider learning more about it and take a look for yourself. Please ask any questions you may have. I am thrilled to be part of this program, and it is my hope that together we can all make a difference that we can all see. Like I said, this is conservation in motion. We are acting now and have a great opportunity to show that we can continue to enjoy the things we love while being good caretakers of the land and animals. Thank you for hearing me out. I look forward to being part of this program and sharing our progress with you. As always, thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.
The reason the take home out of that is just the opportunities to make money with responsible land management, and that'll in turn show proper management for the livestock that we're trying to market. We need to change our business model. The taking them to a local auction and not breaking even is not working for us. And in a way, we're cheapening what we're exchanging the natural resource for. We're converting that grass into nothing, a negative amount. And so we really got to think about these new partnerships. And, I talked to some of these agencies and some of these organizations over the past couple of years. And, what's appealing to them is that there's 55 million acres of tribal rangeland across the United States, from Canada down to Mexico. And he was talking about 1 million. If we got the native ranchers on board, we could have something that is that we could sell at a premium, that is grass finished, if possible. But that's just some opportunities in the future with this conservation. And I'll go ahead and show you this other one that pertains to ranching too. It's 5 minutes long.
My parents bought this ranch in the 1960s when I was 18. Very early, I was immersed in the beauty of the land and how everything worked. And I wanted to try some new things. I felt that there should be alternatives to the traditional livestock model, and I wanted to be part of that. 40% of the Earth's land surface is grasslands, and at this point, most of it is not being managed well.
People wonder why on earth Audubon, a bird conservation group, would be working with cattle ranchers to try to do bird conservation.
Grassland birds are imperiled, many of the species.
For those of us that care about grassland birds, we're often inundated with sad stories about the continued loss of important habitat and important species. But there is a better way. We call it conservation ranching.
They initially identified that 85% of grassland habitat in North America was owned privately. That meant they were going to have to work with private landowners.
So the Audubon Certification Seal really represents a better way to manage land for cattle. And the idea is that you can actually graze cattle on the land in a way that is beneficial to habitat for birds and other wildlife. And it also is beneficial to the whole ecosystem that these ranches are a part of.
Livestock are not innately evil. If they are managed well on the land, they do wonderful things, and we need them. Grasslands historically have co-evolved with grazing animals.
Bison once roamed these systems. Cattle can be used today in a way that mimics the movement of bisons. You get the diversity on the landscape that's good for birds and all sorts of other wildlife.
I'm really thrilled to be working with Audubon. It was very clear to me from the outset that our interests were aligned. They are interested in grassland birds. Birds are a marker for the health of the land. Just got a whole variety of grasses over here. Diversity of grasses is good for pretty much everything. For grazing animals, for wildlife, for birds. All it comes back to the soil.
Implementing this with our certified ranches, we're seeing some amazing results on the ground with plant diversity and habitat diversity and birds that are coming back. I think all of us would like to know that when we purchase food, that it is actually being raised in a way that is better for the land, better for the animals, better for our own health. Audubon is removing the confusion for the consumer by certifying ranches like Nancy's through our program.
I'm excited about the potential for the consumer really buying into what we're doing, really understanding in a visceral way what's happening with their food.
This is a way that we can actually do good things on the land at a scale that starts to matter again. We know it can be done. We now have that choice.
So I do consider myself a conservation rancher. And that's pretty exciting.
So a lot of the upcoming buyers for meat in the future is going to be the millennials, and that's one thing that they're really pushing. The future generation is responsible stewardship, and that is going to lead to some premiums on our end with cattle. So that's just something to keep in mind as we move forward in the future. There is going to be potential for doing marketing yourself and getting educated in marketing and taking it upon yourself to increase your management skills in marketing and contact whoever you need to get that done. I know this is one thing that I'm pushing is to make a collection of these premiums, working with different organizations. And I talked about getting some of that rangeland certified as never treated with chemicals. Same way with animals, never ever cattle that don't have any antibiotics or any growth hormones or anything like that. That's going to lead to a premium. And I think ultimately, this is going to lead to our own tribal food system and our own tribal sovereignty in the future. So, okay, that wraps up my presentation. This is some of my contact information for Indonesian Conservation Alliance. There's my email right there if anybody needs to get a hold of me. And then we also got this Arrowhead Resource Management, where we focus mainly on rangeland and ranching. And you know, I invite you guys to join our Facebook page on either of those. One's Indonesian Conservation Alliance Facebook, and then the other one's Native American Cattle Raisers on Facebook. So you know, I did run over. I apologize. I know everybody's busy. Is there any questions that I can answer?
Thank you, Delane, for your great, your presentation. I know range management is a big concern on the reservation, and you provided great insight by connecting proper and responsible livestock production to range management. I know it's a topic we producers overlook, but know that we can connect in some way. So thank you. Good job. So before you guys log off, I want to invite you all to next month's webinar series regarding conservation planning. If you or you know of a producer in need of completing a conservation plan, please email me at the address provided on the screen. We will post more information here in the next coming weeks of the dates and topics to be covered. Most importantly, we want to assist you with compiling and completing your conservation plan. And I think, this presentation gave all of us an idea of what needs, how the conservation plans come together and why. As I mentioned before, we do have a Facebook page and YouTube channel. Our Facebook page has some useful USDA program information and gardening and livestock publications, also some how-to videos. We also distribute a monthly newsletter. If you would like to receive our monthly newsletters, email me. And then on the last note, we are currently constructing a NAPS website as a central location for all our material that we've produced to further assist you all in the future. So again, thank you, Delane, for your awesome presentation, and thank you all for viewing and joining us today. And also a big thank you to our NAPS team, Michael, Jana, Sadie, Sharon, our co-sponsors and presenters, for making this year's Natural Resource Fair a success and definitely one to remember. So please, I'd like to remind you guys to continue to be safe, wash your hands, wear your mask, and continue practicing social distancing.